Have you ever had that sensation of living inside a dream? That moment when you stop and look around and realize that the entire reality you consider normal, that you accept without questioning, suddenly seems artificial, like an elaborate stage set? It is like briefly waking up inside a dream and realizing you are dreaming, only to be pulled back into the dream narrative seconds later. Many of us have these moments of momentary clarity, these unsettling glimpses, where the plot of reality seems to reveal its seams, where the veil of normality becomes temporarily transparent. And then, almost immediately, the world pulls us back into its rhythm, into its demands, into its fabricated urgencies, and that perception fades like mist under the morning sun. What you glimpsed in that fleeting moment was not an illusion, but precisely the opposite. It was a rare moment of lucidity in the midst of an entire life spent inside collective illusions. And if I tell you that much of what we consider unquestionable reality, from our economic system to our national identities, our social structures, our concept of success, are in fact elaborate collective fictions that survive only because we believe in them collectively, it is about this matrix of shared illusions and how occasionally some people manage to escape them that we will talk today to understand how we are trapped in collective illusions. We must first understand how we humans build social reality. During most of our evolutionary history, we lived in small groups of hunter-gatherers, rarely larger than 150 people. This number is not arbitrary. It is approximately the maximum number of individuals with whom a person can maintain stable relationships and understand who each one is in the group. Beyond that number, our primate brains simply cannot process all the complex social relationships. However, around 70,000 years ago, our species went through what I call the cognitive revolution. We developed the unique ability to create and believe in shared fictions, in stories that exist only in our collective imagination. Suddenly, thousands and even millions of strangers could cooperate effectively because everyone believed in the same stories, the same myths, the same invented rules. Think about money. What is money really? Those paper bills or digits in your bank account have no intrinsic value. A monkey would not trade a banana for a 100 real bill. The value of money exists only because we collectively agree that it has value. It is an extremely useful shared fiction, perhaps the most successful in human history, but still a fiction. In the same way, think of nations. Brazil does not exist in objective reality. You cannot see Brazil from space. What you see are mountains, forests, rivers, cities, but national borders exist only in our shared imagination and in the maps we create to represent them. Yet millions of people are willing to live, fight, and even die for these imaginary lines. Or consider corporations like Google or Petrobras. In a physical sense, they do not exist. You cannot touch Google. You can touch the buildings where Google employees work. You can touch the computers they use. But the entity Google itself is a legal and social construction that exists only because we collectively believe it exists. What is extraordinary is not just that we created these fictions, but that somehow we forgot we invented them. We begin treating them as objective realities, as laws of nature, instead of contingent social constructions that could be different, it is as if we are hypnotized by our own stories. And even more extraordinary is that these fictions have real power in the world. If I try entering the United States without a visa, a totally imaginary object, I will be detained by very real men with very real guns. Physical reality ends up bowing to shared fiction. Now, this is not necessarily bad. These shared fictions are what allowed our species to cooperate on an unprecedented scale and create complex civilizations. Without them, we would be limited to small tribal groups like our ancestors. However, the problem arises when we confuse these social constructions with absolute reality, when we forget that we are the creators of these stories and begin seeing ourselves as mere pieces within them. It is like a playwright who forgets he wrote the play and believes he is simply following a script handed to him by the universe. Let us consider one of these particularly powerful fictions today, the narrative of perpetual economic growth. For most of human history, economies grew very slowly or not at all. It was only in recent centuries that we adopted the idea that economies not only can, but must grow continuously, year after year, forever. This has become so fundamental to our worldview that we rarely question its logic. However, any infinite growth on a finite planet is mathematically impossible. It is a fundamental contradiction. But we built entire societies, political systems, and personal identities around this particular illusion. Or consider the fiction of modern consumerism, the story that more consumption leads to more happiness. This narrative is bombarded into our minds since childhood through advertising, popular culture, and even education. We are conditioned to believe that the next phone, the next car, the next house, the next clothing item will bring lasting satisfaction. However, decades of research in psychology have repeatedly shown that once our basic needs are met, additional material goods contribute very little to sustained happiness. In fact, the most consumerist societies often have high rates of depression, anxiety, and other mental health problems. Yet, we continue collectively in this rat race, as if we could not imagine an alternative. Perhaps the deepest illusion is that of a fixed identity. From early on, we are taught that we have a stable and coherent self, a fundamental identity that remains constant over time. However, both neuroscience and Buddhist philosophy have long pointed to the illusory nature of this concept. The brain is a process, not a fixed entity. We are constantly changing in response to our experiences. The cells of our body are completely replaced every few years. Our preferences, beliefs, and even personalities change over time. Yet, we desperately cling to this notion of a permanent self, often causing ourselves suffering when reality does not align with our constructed self-image. I need to stop for a moment and ask you directly, which aspect of this future built upon collective illusions most awakens your fear or apprehension? Do you lie awake at night thinking about this too? I know that many times we keep these concerns to ourselves, perhaps for fear of seeming paranoid or naive in a world that celebrates every new shared narrative without questioning, but your concerns are valid and probably shared by more people than you imagine. Share in the comments. My greatest fear about our future built on collective illusions is your voice can help create a space where we can honestly discuss these collective fears instead of suppressing them. And perhaps by naming these fears together, we can begin imagining ways to face them. But going back to our discussion, what happens when someone starts seeing through these collective illusions? History is full of individuals who questioned the dominant narratives of their times and tried to awaken others. Think of Socrates questioning the conventions of Athenian society, of Gautama Buddha rejecting the Hindu caste system, of Galileo defying the church's geocentric cosmology, or of Martin Luther King Jr. confronting the fiction of racial supremacy. These individuals were not just proposing alternative ideas, they were challenging the very structure of social reality as it was understood in their times. And what was the result? Socrates was forced to drink hemlock. Buddha was initially ridiculed. Galileo was placed under house arrest for the rest of his life. King was assassinated. Human societies do not react well when their fundamental illusions are threatened. As philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer wrote, all truth passes through 3 stages. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently rejected. Third, it is accepted as self-evident. This is the almost inevitable fate of those who dare awaken from the collective illusion and try to awaken others. Why do we react so violently when our shared illusions are threatened? Because they form the foundation of our social reality. Questioning these illusions is not just challenging a specific idea, but potentially the entire structure that gives meaning to people's lives. It is like removing a cornerstone from a building. The entire structure may collapse, and that is extremely uncomfortable, even terrifying. However, something interesting is happening in our current era. With the advent of the internet and instant global communication, people are being exposed to multiple social realities, multiple collective fictions, all at the same time. A young person growing up today can easily learn the myths and beliefs of cultures on the other side of the world, can see how different societies construct their social realities in radically different ways. And this potentially makes it harder to believe that any one of these fictions is absolute or inevitable. When we see the diversity of ways humans organize their societies, it becomes harder to believe that our particular way is the only possible or the best. At the same time, digital technologies are creating new shared fictions at an unprecedented speed. Think of cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. In a matter of years, not decades or centuries, millions of people began believing in the value of a totally digital currency that exists only as lines of code. Or consider the online identities many of us build on social networks, digital personas that may have little resemblance to who we are in the physical world, but nonetheless take on a reality of their own. We are now creating and inhabiting collective fictions at an accelerated pace, and in many cases, we are more aware of their constructed nature Virtual reality technology is perhaps the most literal example of how we are increasingly inhabiting constructed realities. When we put on a virtual reality headset, we are consciously entering a simulated world. But what is fascinating is how our brains quickly accept this simulation as real. Our hearts race when we stand at the edge of a virtual cliff, even knowing intellectually that we are safe in our living room. This suggests something profound about the nature of human consciousness and our relationship with reality. Perhaps all reality is, in a certain sense, virtual, constructed by the brain from sensory data and interpreted through layers of concepts and stories. This brings us to a crucial question. If all of our social structures are essentially shared fictions, if our identities are fluid constructions rather than fixed entities, if we are constantly creating and recreating reality through collective narratives, then what is real? Is there any solid reality beneath all these layers of interpretation and social construction? Cognitive scientists often speak of what they call the blue sky of consciousness, or pure consciousness, a state of direct perception before the brain begins to categorize and interpret. It is that brief moment in which you simply see, hear, feel, before the mind says, this is a chair, or that person looks angry, or I need to hurry. It is a direct experience of reality before the stories begin. Experienced meditators describe this as a state of extraordinary clarity, as if they were seeing the world for the first time, free from the distortions of expectations and pre-existing concepts. Perhaps this is what it means to escape the collective illusion on the most fundamental level. It is not about rejecting all shared fictions, which would be impossible for any human being functioning in society. Instead, it is about developing the ability to see these fictions for what they are, useful but contingent tools, not absolute truths. It is the ability to inhabit these stories while maintaining a certain lightness and awareness of their constructed nature. It is like the actor who can surrender completely to their role on stage, yet does not confuse the character with their true self. Contemplative traditions around the world, from Zen Buddhism to Sufism, from Christian mystics to Stoic philosophers, have described this process in different ways. But they all point to a fundamental transformation in the relationship with conceptual thought and social narratives. It is not about abandoning thought, which is a valuable tool, but about recognizing that the map is not the territory, that our concepts about reality are not reality itself. This brings us to modern technology and its relationship with our shared fictions. We are living in an era of unprecedented informational overload. The average human today is bombarded with more information in a single day than a person in the 17th century likely received in their entire lifetime. Our technologies constantly connect us to infinite streams of news, opinions, images, videos, all competing for our limited attention. And this overload is making it increasingly difficult to discern what is real, what is important, what deserves our attention. Paradoxically, while the amount of information has exploded, our ability to assign meaning to that information seems to be diminishing. We are suffering from what contemporary philosopher Byung-Chul Han calls the hell of the same, where the overabundance of information leads to a kind of flattening in which nothing seems to matter more than anything else. A global tragedy appears in our feeds next to a cat video, a political crisis next to a shoe promotion. Everything reduced to the same level, everything consumed in the same endless stream of content. This condition is creating a new form of imprisonment within collective illusions. It is no longer so much that we are deeply invested in a particular narrative, but that we are perpetually distracted, jumping from one narrative to another without ever really examining any of them deeply. We are so busy processing the constant flow of information that we lose the ability to pause, reflect, and question the fundamental premises of that information. In other words, informational overload is making it harder, not easier, to escape collective illusions. At the same time, our technologies are becoming increasingly skilled at detecting and exploiting our psychological vulnerabilities. The algorithms that control our social media platforms, news apps, and e-commerce sites are specifically designed to maximize the time, attention, and money we spend on them. They learn which emotional triggers keep us engaged, which fears and desires can be manipulated to keep our eyes on the screen. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is the explicit business model of these platforms. The result is a form of psychological manipulation on an industrial scale. Our attention, which is fundamentally the most precious resource we have as conscious beings, is being systematically harvested and sold to the highest bidder. And while our attention is trapped in these cycles of algorithmic engagement, it becomes increasingly difficult to find the mental space necessary to question the deeper collective illusions that structure our reality. This is the great irony of the information age. We have access to more knowledge than any previous generation, but we are increasingly trapped in echo chambers and feedback loops that reinforce rather than challenge our existing illusions. We are being programmed by our own devices, conditioned to react instead of reflect, to consume instead of contemplate. Yet, in the midst of all this algorithmic manipulation and informational overload, something interesting is happening. A growing number of people are beginning to recognize the nature of these dynamics and actively seeking ways to reclaim their mental autonomy. We see this in the rising interest in meditation and contemplative practices, in the humane technology movement that seeks to design technologies that respect rather than exploit our psychological vulnerabilities, in the resurgence of interest in ancient philosophies that offer tools to cultivate mental clarity in the face of distraction. These are small seeds of a possible counter-movement, signs that even as our technological systems become more sophisticated in manipulating our attention and reinforcing collective illusions, our capacity to recognize and resist this manipulation is also evolving. As in any complex system, when one force becomes dominant, compensatory forces begin to emerge. What is particularly fascinating is that many people who are starting to wake up from collective illusions are not rejecting technology altogether. Instead, they are seeking a more conscious and intentional relationship with it. They are exploring ways to use digital tools that expand rather than diminish their mental autonomy, that expand rather than contract their awareness, from meditation apps that help cultivate mindfulness to alternative platforms that prioritize deep reflection over superficial engagement, we are seeing the beginnings of what could be called a consciousness counterculture within the digital environment itself. Historically, when people began to see through dominant collective illusions, they often withdrew from society, forming alternative communities or seeking isolation. Think of Buddhist monasteries, the communes of the 1960 seconds, or figures like Thoreau retreating to Walden Pond. There was an implicit recognition that it was difficult, if not impossible, to maintain mental clarity while fully immersed in the social environment that sustained the illusions. Today, however, we are seeing something potentially new emerge. Instead of a physical withdrawal from society, we are witnessing attempts to create spaces of clarity within the very fabric of hyper-connected modern life. It is as if people are trying to remain in the world but not be completely of the world, to participate in technological society but maintain a certain critical distance from it, to use digital tools without being used by them. This brings us back to the central question: what does it really mean to escape the collective illusion in the 21st century? Perhaps it is not a matter of completely abandoning all stories and social structures. After all, we need shared narratives to function as a society. Instead, it may be a matter of developing what we could call narrative literacy, the ability to recognize stories for what they are, to understand how they shape our perceptions and behaviors, and to consciously choose which stories we want to inhabit. In this sense, escaping the illusion is not so much about escaping to somewhere outside all collective fictions, but about developing the mobility to move among different narratives, to inhabit multiple perspectives, to recognize that no single story, no matter how compelling, can capture the totality of human experience. Think of the example of someone who grows up deeply immersed in a single religious tradition, accepting its doctrines and practices without question, and then gradually begins to explore other spiritual traditions, philosophies, and scientific worldviews. Initially, there may be a period of crisis when previous certainties begin to crumble, but eventually, this person may arrive at a place where they are able to appreciate the wisdom and beauty of their original tradition without being limited by its more dogmatic or restrictive aspects. They develop the ability to inhabit multiple perspectives, to see their original tradition as one among many valid ways of making sense of human existence. This kind of narrative mobility, this ability to shift perspective, is perhaps the mark of someone who has begun to awaken from collective illusions. It is not that they no longer have beliefs or values. It is that they are less rigidly identified with any particular set of beliefs and values, more open to revision and refinement in light of new evidence and perspectives. Neuroscientists have a term for this: cognitive flexibility. It is the ability of the brain to adapt thinking and behavior in response to new, unexpected, or changing situations. People with high cognitive flexibility are better at shifting between different concepts, considering multiple aspects of a problem simultaneously, and adjusting their behavior when rules or scenarios change. In essence, they are less trapped in rigid thought patterns and more able to navigate complex and changing environments. This flexibility can be cultivated. In fact, practices such as mindfulness meditation have been shown to increase cognitive flexibility by training the brain to observe thoughts and emotions without immediately reacting to them or identifying with them. It is a kind of meta-awareness, an ability to observe the mind itself in operation, which creates the space for more conscious choices about which thoughts to follow and which to let pass. On a social level, we could say that people who have escaped the collective illusion are developing an analogous form of socio-cognitive flexibility. They are able to participate in multiple social systems, multiple communities and cultures, without being completely defined or limited by any of them. They can navigate between different social contexts while maintaining a sense of continuity and agency. This flexibility seems increasingly important in a world characterized by accelerated change, cultural diversity, and interconnected complexity. The shared fictions that structure our social reality are transforming at an unprecedented rate. National identities, gender, work, family, all these constructions are undergoing profound transformations. People unable to adapt their personal narratives in the face of this change often retreat into fundamentalism of various kinds, clinging rigidly to old stories out of fear of completely losing meaning. On the other hand, those who have developed narrative flexibility can navigate these changes with more grace and resilience. They can inhabit the transformations without being completely disoriented by them. They can participate in the creation of new social narratives that better meet the emerging needs of humanity without completely losing continuity with the past. However, this mobility is not without its challenges. When we begin to see the constructed nature of all identities and social structures, a kind of existential vertigo can arise. If everything is in some sense a social construction, a shared fiction, then where do we find solid ground? How do we decide which stories are worth inhabiting? What prevents us from falling into an empty relativism where nothing really matters? These are serious questions, and they do not have easy answers. But perhaps the direction to explore them is not through more intellectual abstractions, but through a deeper engagement with direct experience. Beyond all our conceptual constructions and social identities, we are still embodied beings living in a physical world, capable of directly experiencing the warmth of the sun on our skin, the connection with other beings, the wonder of being alive in a vast and mysterious universe. Perhaps it is in this domain of direct experience that we can find a kind of grounding that neither depends rigidly on any particular narrative, nor falls into a nihilistic void. It is not a matter of finding the true story that explains everything, but of cultivating a relationship with reality that is simultaneously more immediate and more flexible, less mediated by fixed concepts, and more attuned to the flow of living experience. This orientation toward direct experience is not new. In fact, contemplative traditions have emphasized this for millennia. What is new is the technological context in which we must now navigate it. How do we maintain this connection with direct experience, this openness to unmediated reality in a world increasingly dominated by mediated realities, by screens, algorithms, and virtual environments. This is perhaps the most urgent question for anyone trying to escape the collective illusion today. And there is no single or simple answer. Each of us must find our own path, our own balance between engagement and distance, between social participation and individual clarity, between using technological tools and being used by them. What seems clear, however, is that this process is not something we can face entirely alone. We need each other. We need communities of practice, safe spaces, where we can explore these questions together, where we can share both our discoveries and our struggles as we navigate the complexities of modern life. Throughout human history, whenever people began to awaken from the dominant illusions of their time, they tended to find and support each other. Think of the philosophical circles of ancient Greece, the early Buddhist communities in India, the early Christian monasteries, the intellectual salons of the Enlightenment, contemporary contemplative communities. There has always been an implicit recognition that this kind of awakening is a collective endeavor, that we need fellow travelers on the path, and perhaps more than ever, we need those companions today. The pressure to conform to dominant narratives, to unquestioningly accept existing structures, is immense. The forces that benefit from our collective sleep are powerful. The sensory and informational overload we face is overwhelming. No one can navigate all of this completely alone. That is why spaces like this are so important. We are creating together a place where these questions can be explored openly, where these realities can be named, where we can help each other maintain clarity in the face of growing confusion. It is not just about consuming content, but about participating in an ongoing conversation, a collective inquiry into what it means to be human in this extraordinary era. If these reflections touched on something you have been feeling, but perhaps had no words to express, know that you are not alone. By subscribing to the channel, you connect with a growing community of people who share your concerns and your desire for a deeper understanding of the philosophical challenges of our time. Each week, we meet here to explore together the great questions that define our era and to seek not only understanding, but also wiser ways of living amid the transformations we are witnessing. This is not just a channel, but a space for dialogue and collective growth. Join us on this ongoing journey. Subscribe so that we can continue this essential conversation about how to live with more wisdom and purpose in a world that so often leaves us disoriented and divided. In the end, perhaps escaping the collective illusion is not about reaching some final state of complete enlightenment or seeing through absolutely every social construction. That is probably not possible for any human being living in society. Instead, it is more like an ongoing awakening, a constant practice of questioning, of being attentive, of not taking dominant narratives for granted. It is about cultivating the ability to see the invisible structures that shape our reality, not to reject them completely, but to relate to them more consciously and deliberately. And perhaps most importantly, it is about reclaiming a sense of agency and responsibility for these narratives. If the collective fictions that structure our social reality are indeed human creations, then we have the power to recreate them. We are not mere passive spectators in a world handed to us as complete and immutable, but active co-creators of our shared reality. And with that power comes a profound responsibility. The responsibility to consciously participate in the creation of a world that honors the truth of our interdependence, our shared humanity, and our coexistence with the entire web of life on this extraordinary planet. This is the invitation that presents itself to each of us, not only to escape the existing collective illusions, but to participate in the creation of new shared narratives that are more true, more compassionate, and more conducive to the flourishing of all life. It is a work that never ends, a journey that continues to unfold, an ongoing dialogue between the individual and the collective, between the past and the future, between what is and what could be. It is in this dialogue that we find our fullest humanity, and it is to this dialogue that I invite you to join.
When you destroy an order and you don't have any alternative order, what you get is chaos. What you get is disorder. We are on really the edge of the precipice in two distinct but related ways. On the one hand, after the most peaceful era in human history of the last few decades, which was a very problematic, very violent era in many ways. I come from the Middle East, I know this perfectly well, but in comparative terms, it was still the most peaceful era in human history, characterized by unprecedented levels of cooperation and also of human prosperity. The order that enabled this is now collapsing. There is no viable alternative, at least we don't hear of one at the present. When you destroy an order and you don't have any alternative order, what you get is chaos. What you get is disorder. We are now falling into chaos, into disorder. The danger is that levels of violence, which have been historically low over the last 20, 30, 40 years, could become worse than ever because of the technologies of destruction that we are creating and amassing. It's just a tiny symbol of the times that has been commented in recent days by many people, that change in terminology in the United States from Department of Defense to Department of War.
What did you make of that? Yeah.
It's plain. There is no need of very complicated explanations. It's just shifting from defense to war. What could be more easy to understand?
The situation is very difficult because we see that humans are losing trust in each other. The order is collapsing, both within countries and also between countries. Maybe the most worrying thing is that there is no leadership for humanity at the present moment, because the strongest country in the world, the United States, now openly says that it cares mainly about making itself stronger, even at the expense of other countries. At this moment in history, what we need above all is to have good leadership that will unite humanity instead of dividing it in order to deal with both climate change and the rise of artificial intelligence.
Humans are the most intelligent animals on the planet. They are also the most delusional entities on the planet. A super intelligence is likely to be super delusional as well. Nothing in human history indicates that intelligence is a good antidote to delusion or necessarily puts you on a path towards the truth. I think that the impulse towards truth comes really from consciousness. And since there is no evidence that AI has consciousness, and maybe it will develop, maybe as we speak, the first conscious AI is being born somewhere.
But so far we have no convincing evidence that it is conscious, that it's capable of suffering. One of, I think, the big delusions of places like Silicon Valley is this overemphasis on intelligence, which is partly because there are extremely intelligent people there, who their life is built on intelligence, and they tend to overvalue intelligence. And this is a very dangerous thing. My kind of historical instinct is that a super intelligent AI, if it lacks consciousness, it will not pursue the truth. It will very quickly start to pursue other things, which will be shaped by delusions of various types.